Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Sunday Stream. We are on episode 30, and as a much awaited topic of discussion, given everything that's been happening over the last year in this area of the world, we are finally beginning to address the issue over Taiwan, conflict, diplomacy, and saber rattling. And I think that it is fitting for today that it is labeled on today's presentation and lecture that it is a tragedy, because the various views that we have are going to be discussing today range anywhere from confrontation, political sublimation of ideas of a national identity, and the likelihood of conflict between two clashing worldviews, ideologies, and push for hegemony. So as all of you all pour in, welcome. And let's just give you all a brief overview of what we'll be doing today. But before I get to that, just some general announcements, because I didn't fit it in my announcement slide at the end. Tomorrow evening at 8 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Central U.S. time, I will be over at Mr. Joel Davis's channel discussing John J. Mearsheimer and his seminal work, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, one of my biggest influences. So I'm very much looking forward to that discussion. It will be over at his channel tomorrow. I have already posted it in the community tab, so by all means, enjoy. So with all that in mind, let's give an overview for today. It's important, as always, image on the right for a map for those of you who are geographically impaired, so that's usually my American audience. I wanted to just give a brief outline for today's lecture, just some of the aspects of 1949 and the Chinese Civil War and its interregnum between the Second World War. The policies of the United States, specifically on Kissinger on Taiwan and what's happened since 1979. And then a brief rundown on the rudimentary information on Taiwan, how it views itself, how it identifies politically, and then discuss the varying viewpoints on what is the Taiwan question, specifically in the minds of, actual likelihood of conflict, the question of governing regimes, political infiltration, and new forms of conflict that we see. On top of that, of course, will be the question of war itself, and my view on it, along with some final thoughts. So, with all that in mind, let's get started. All right, so as we kind of know, the ending, sort of like if you were to start reading the Bible and someone says, spoiler alert, Christ dies but is reborn, the same thing happens here. Spoiler alert, the communists win after two parts of this civil war. And to put it into perspective, I mean, millions of civilians died, along with hundreds of thousands of troops on the communist side, as well as the KMT, the Kuomintang, led by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-Shek. Of course, also it led to about roughly 1.5 million casualties throughout both parts of the war. Of course, the Sino-Japanese War is the intervention. This is why it's broken down into two parts. And during the time of the Second World War, towards the end, as Harry Truman takes office, the official policy of the United States was to use the Japanese to hold off the communists. And in doing so, however, as soon as the war ends between the United States and Japan and a formal surrender is taking place, the United States immediately begins securing strategic ports, strategic cities, and areas of manufacturing that were once held in Japanese hands, trying to swiftly, in doing so, keep control before the CCP, the Communist Party of China, is moving towards and securing those positions to renew the war. During the time of Sino-Japanese war and Japanese occupation of mainland China, specifically around Manchuria and other areas, one of the things to keep in mind is that there was a claim and a push for by the United States that there should be a ceasefire between the Kuomintang and the communists. However, Chiang Kai-Shek had said no, that the biggest threat towards China would be that of the communists. Well, rightfully so, in my opinion. I am no fan of communism. I'm sure many people who watch this channel aren't either. The lack of a ceasefire had led to more bloody conflicts of essentially fighting a two-front war between the communists as well as the Japanese. After the war, however, prior from 1945 to 1949, when the Great Retreat begins, you are seeing billions of dollars in taxpayer money from the United States pour into the Kuomintang and trying to keep their military forces alive. This ranges from everything to military armaments, technical advisors, manufacturing, machine tools to keep ammunition winning. all of which, right, was done in the same way. And in fact, it wasn't just the United States that was giving support to the KMT. I know that in the second part of the war, or during the war itself, the Second World War, the Soviets had also provided funds to the KMT. To how much, I do not know off the top of my head. I do know that they provided arms and intelligence to the KMT and its military in order to ensure that the Japanese were bogged down and weren't going to make any sort of moves towards eastern or western parts of Russia, what we would call, ironically, the East. That's how large Russia is as a geographic landmass. But despite this material support, sieges, and the promises of land reform in the midst of vast amounts of famine, of course, during these sieges, there were hundreds of thousands of civilians that would die in the fighting in between the KMT and the communists. But the promises of land reform, the doubling down, and no promising political strategy from what you would call the nationalist side inevitably leads to its loss. So you see the Great Retreat and the declaration on October 1st, 1949 of the People's Republic of China with Mao Zedong. And in doing so, there's about a 4 to 6 month period of KMT forces airlifting and moving out of mainland China to what would be now Taiwan, which puts us now in the sort of position we are in today, from roughly the creation of the People's Republic of China until about the early 1950s. There's a great debate over recognition. And from there, the People's Republic of China over the Republic of China, the ROC and the PRC, the People's Republic of China is officially recognized. Chiang Kai-Shek and the Republic of China sort of leaves the UN delegation, and it becomes the de facto nation that is recognized on the United Nations Security Council and recognized more or less internationally. We'll be discussing international official diplomatic relations later in today's lecture. But as you can see on the right, there's the Generalissimo himself, the founder and leader of the KMT forces, and later the establishment of the Republic of Taiwan. So, prior to what is known as the pivot to Asia that we'll see during the Barack Obama administration, I do want to talk about the sort of American policy towards Taiwan and the People's Republic of China during this time frame. Of course, the initial acceptance over Chinese control was, the idea that China would eventually claim it. There were territorial claims. This was something that has been historically recognized by American diplomats at the time. Support to Shek and the Republic of China was only passive in both diplomatic efforts, financial aid, and reconstruction. What really sets it off, though, in terms of our question over Taiwan and its recognition as a state or American support over it, becomes the Treaty of San Francisco in 1952, which is the official formal declaration of peace between the United States and Japan, which also brings about the end of American occupation of Japan, or the interim government before Japan adopts its new constitution in doing so. With that, the treaty later meets again in 1952, similarly afterwards, where the relations between Japan and Taiwan are sort of settled. Japan formally, withdraws and relinquishes any sort of territorial claim it had from Taiwan. And in doing so, this is where it really sets up the question between what is the United States to do now with a nation that claims to be the, government in exile of sorts of the mainland China, like landmass and its people, compared to the internationally recognized, effective, standing both with military, the examination of nuclear weapons, and a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, is where things become a mix of practical foreign policy and American party politics in line. So, of course, there's the great, anti-communist sentiment. There is the American doctrine of proposal, as discussed by American diplomats such as George F. Kennan, and even ranging from Truman to Eisenhower, this policy of containment to stop one state from falling into communist hands, leading to others, especially within Southeast Asia. However, roughly around the 1960s, what really begins to change is the Sino-Soviet split. Differentiation over Marx and the interpretations of Leninism within the two countries leads to sort of this political and ideological split over, who is the true inheritor of the communist cause. And both American diplomats and others in the West are really wanting to capitalize on this, especially. Why not try and isolate your greatest enemy from its second largest ideological proponent, being that of the People's Republic of China? So prior to Nixon making his famous visit to China in 1972, Henry Kissinger and several others of an American establishment, and it's the short National Security Circle in the State Department, meet with, Premier Zhou Enlai in 1971 prior to the famous meeting where Nixon goes to China. And I've discussed this earlier on our streams, in these streams and on the show with David Carlson, that Kissinger's viewpoint towards Taiwan was that there is a strong historical argument and claim for mainland China to have a claim over that of, the Republic of China and Chiang Kai-Shek. And the United States is in a bind because while we have no desire to necessarily engage or put ourselves out there to defend Taiwan, party politics at home, specifically strong anti-communist sentiments, sort of prevent us from engaging in a more realistic policy and putting themselves in a position to accept or try and reintegrate Taiwan back into mainland China. For the sake of today's discussion, I'll make it clear, I'm not going to try and say PRC or ROC. I'm just going to use China and Taiwan. I think it's very clear that we know who we're talking about. They're two vastly different forms of government and worldview. And the question, of course, we'll be addressing today is war and reunification. So following, of course, this meeting in towards the 1980s, 90s, and today, you are seeing a strong emphasis, especially post-Cold War, about trade liberalization, the favored nation status, and within the WTO, which eventually becomes permanent, I believe, in 2000. Correct me if I'm wrong. But in doing so, there was this large argument between a lot of foreign policy officials, and mainly liberals, I would say, neoliberals, constructivists, not necessarily the realists, mind you. But there was this discussion, and you'll see this if you want to take a look at some foreign policy journals and texts, and especially books at this time, where the argument was that trade liberalization will inevitably lead towards democratization. And all of which, of course, as history has proven to us now, it doesn't really pan out the way that we thought it would, especially between the foreign policy establishment of the United States. And in fact, during the 1992 presidential election, Bill Clinton had argued that China was a strong issue of foreign policy importance, to which George H.W. Bush was not being tough enough on. However, roughly 2 years into Bill Clinton's first term, he begins, supporting China trade liberalization, putting forward out more and more money in towards foreign direct investment, ushering in the Congress to increase, or decrease, the barriers to entry for foreign direct investment inside of the People's Republic of China in order to increase trade between the two countries. And along with this, and then the ever so infamous now North American Free Trade Association, the Ross Perot quote of that giant suckling sound really begins to hit itself real hard. The American manufacturing, of course, is dying out. And then, of course, even more so with the suckling of jobs, and now more manufacturing in Mexico than in the United States. So this real strong format of economic interdependence really strikes out in a way wherein it becomes sort of the predominant policy there. And we see this especially more so on the American left, the Democratic Party, or even progressives arguing that this is a way to include them into the international community. This form of investment will inevitably be harder and harder to control as more trade liberalization increases. And in doing so, it may inevitably lead to democratization as it becomes harder and harder to centrally control an economy that is roughly free market within 1.2 billion people. And as we kind of know now, really isn't going to be the case. So there's this policy of what is known as faux containment, and we'll get into that in just a second, along with the American pivot to Asia. But as we know from our understanding of history, as well as the criticisms that come out of American foreign policy, that the post-Cold War idealism that comes with triumphalism or American primacy, post-Cold War, is the argument of what's good for them is what's good for us. So this real heavy focus on the neoliberal investment, the idea of getting more engaged with them, stop viewing them as a competitor, bring them into the international community, especially as other things begin to happen along with, Hong Kong being relinquished by the UK and putting them towards under Chinese control. This, of course, is something that we can see really wakes the United States up roughly around 2011 under Barack Obama. And in doing so, one thing that the United States really starts off with, of course, is the recognition that they are not prepared for a multipolar world when their entire time of empire has been in this either bipolar world or a unipolar world where the United States is rising as the necessary economic hegemon, its military status, all during a time where there is declining imperial Europe and a time wherein the Soviet Union cannot match itself economically. At no time during the Cold War, as Barry Posen will tell you, that the purchasing power parity and the gross domestic product of the United States was ever matched by the Soviet Union. In fact, it was always at more or less a degree of 2-to-1 ratio of the United States. And one thing that Barry Posen and I will also talk about as well, as these gentlemen are large influences of mine, is that this is an enemy or competitor or a hegemonic rival that the United States is not going to be, able to engage the same way it engaged in the Soviet Union. But the United States, of course, sticks to what it knows best, right? So, liberalization and democratization are seen to be the policy mainly of the, liberal foreign policy makers. And in doing so, we see it as a failure. We know that, especially now, the CCP and its current leader, of course, under President Xi Jinping, has been able to successfully manage the controlling of state-owned enterprises. We have recognized in the past, you can even look it up right now, the number of billionaires that have either been imprisoned or executed by the Chinese government, where most of these businesses, of course, are state-operated enterprises, SOEs, a very vital term to know when we talk about China's economy. And in doing so, there has been a shift after 2001. After the, of course, September 11th attacks in the United States, President George W. Bush begins to increase its naval presence in the Asiatic region. This includes the South China Sea, moving the 7th Fleet over with more numbers towards Japan and Okinawa, and of course in areas regarding the Middle East, specifically around like the Strait of Hormuz and the Gulf Coast, in order to make sure that, we're policing the area, that there's an American presence there, that there is logistical support for American troops that are in the region, especially at the time as we invade Iraq and Afghanistan. The real pivot to Asia doesn't really come around until Barack Obama 10 years later in 2011. This is when it's really announced as the real pivot to Asia. And what has happened since then has been the idea of increasing through trade and diplomacy, of trying to keep China contained in this sort of neoliberal bloc, trying to incorporate them into trade agreements. This is why during the second term of Barack Obama, you see a significant influence and emphasis on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It was argued at the time, both by then candidate Hillary Clinton as well as President Barack Obama, that this would be a greater way to integrate China into the international community, still operating more or less under the same modus operandi of, liberal thinkers of the past, that the United States and China can, adopt similar views and policies, not to mention that the concern over economic interdependence makes them highly invested in how China operates and how China treats them. And we'll get into that later in today's stream when we actually address the question. But what has happened since then, of course, is concerns over military investment. As we've talked about in previous streams, China is sort of trying to, one, increase its economic hegemony in the region. It recognizes that it doesn't have the necessary natural resources within its own borders to maintain and secure what it needs for its domestic economy and manufacturing. We can even see this today by talking about coal shortages and power rollouts. On top of this includes the Belt and Road Initiative. A lot of this is laid out in Xi Jinping's plan for governing China in his 2014 document when he sort of ascends to power. There's a lot of stuff in there that I highly recommend anyone read. There is an English translation available. I think you can get it anywhere on Amazon or Barnes & Noble. So in doing so, China tries to expand and engages in a relationship with Russia, primarily over natural resources, which is one of the biggest leverages that Russia has in the post-Cold War environment, especially as it is facing increasing pressures from what we call the West, especially under the European Union and North Atlantic Treaty Organization, reneging on their promises at the end of the Cold War and are essentially moving NATO ever so closer, and by extension the European Union, closer and closer to Russia's borders. And in doing so, Russia has moved closer to China because of this. The United States has responded more so now a military approach. This includes, patrolling the area, which often gets claimed to be espionage, but it is done under this obscure, but we're now very publicly well-known aspect of international maritime law, known as freedom of navigation operations. So essentially just announcing that you are navigating and you are trying to find the best way through. This is not done for any sort of military or harmful intent. And the United States has been doing this for some time and has only increased since Barack Obama and Trump have been in office. In fact, just here, I have a picture on the right of the United States naval destroyer, the USS Benfold, in the Taiwan Strait between China and Taiwan, just this last July in 2021. On top of that, there's been concerns of espionage, the stealing of intellectual property for American technology. This is why you'll get people like Bronze Age Pervert explaining that China's form of military R&D is, imitative and not necessarily innovative, although I think that's beginning to change, especially in the realm of computers. And then, of course, manufacturing, production, and even at-home espionage here in the United States when it comes towards American colleges. So with all of this in mind, this kind of allows us to transition and just give some basic facts of what we're dealing with. So on top of the map, we're looking at Taiwan as just this country, one of the most densely populated areas in the world, with a population nearing 25 million people based upon the latest census data that is available from that country. It is majority Han Chinese. Roughly 95% of the country is of Han Chinese origin, although there are other minority and indigenous groups in the area with various languages, however, Mandarin and Formosa being some of the most prominent. However, this comes back to the issue we were talking about earlier in regards to diplomacy and international recognition. While a majority of the world, including the United States, recognizes that there is that there is the People's Republic of China, this is who we engage diplomatic relations with, there are 14 countries, including the Holy See, that maintains formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan, although I believe of the 14 countries, almost none of them are what you would see as the Western Bloc. The United States maintains, a quasi-non-official embassy in that area, or on Taiwan. So does the United Kingdom, and both the United States and the UK push diplomatically for them to put themselves out there and engage in the international community in ways where statehood is not a requirement. So almost in the same way where, Palestine is recognized by a lot of left-leaning countries in the West, sort of the same thing happens in sort of the sort of rightist or hawkish neoconservative worldview in towards the United States when it comes to Taiwan. It is home to major financial sectors, so foreign index markets, foreign exchange markets are there in the same way that London is a major center for commodities and foreign currency exchange trading. And then, of course, there is the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, which is one of the largest semiconductor manufacturing companies in the world. And most recently, they have made an announcement that by 2025, they will be moving most of their production and manufacturing plants towards Japan. One, to help jumpstart the Japanese economy, but as I think is likely being able to tell us from the likelihood of saber-rattling, conflict, or some sort of eventual reunification of Taiwan towards the People's Republic of China, they would like to get the hell out of there. And that is something that has been talked about from Vox Day and even here. So there's quite a few people on the right that recognizes that one of the companies that, produces almost, I want to say half, last I checked when I was doing my research this week, almost half of the world's semiconductor supplies, which also kind of adds into the question of semiconductor supply chains, right? And when we see about chip shortages, which makes, used cars more expensive, why you can't get a hold of things like a RTX 3090, not to mention scalpers. But yeah, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company is one of the largest in the world and provides a massive amount of semiconductors, chips, and such to the West. And this, of course, is one of the biggest things that is put into place, not to mention the ideological concerns between the United States and mainland China, which is what we're going to dive into next. So there are two worldviews that I kind of want to talk about, or ideas. One from John J. Mearsheimer, the other from Samuel P. Huntington. But Nicholas Saldo put out a really good piece not too long ago talking about the four competing regimes. This is on his Substack. His Substack is called Fisted by Foucault. If you're not following him on Substack, you should. He's a neo-realist. He offers really good understanding of governance. And not to mention the interviews he puts out are hilarious. But anyways, these are the two gentlemen that I kind of want to refer to for today's, in this viewpoint of Clash of Civilizations. So as you know, Samuel P. Huntington, in his now famous 1996 book, discusses that there are problems in regards to how the West views the rest of the world. This is a critique that he provides, that there are different basic foundational civilizational states or identities that we can see in blocks of the world. You do have the Islamic world of the Middle East, Sub-Saharan North Africa, any place that had seen the ancient Islamic expansion from like 632 AD after Muhammad dies to roughly 732 AD to the Battle of Tours Poitiers and France near the Pyrenees. All of this talks about, this is sort of what is known as the Islamic world. And then, of course, you have the greater aspect and identities of civilizations within Africa, the argument being that, there's various, it is tribal, it is based upon tribal identity. Faith does play a role, but not nearly as much. And, of course, these are the post-colonial states, which sort of form his own block, which you can probably criticize. But then he also talks about the relationships that come with the problem of the United States, or what he calls the West, which includes Western Europe, under this sort of American security umbrella, about liberal universalism. And the critique that he makes, right, is that he talks about, say, the United States wanting to engage with the Islamic world. The argument therein being is the most famous one, I think it's a very poignant and famous quote in the book, is that for the United States and the Western world, it looks at Islam and it says that it wishes to modernize Islam, whereas Islam looks at the West and the modern world and wishes to Islamize modernity. And to me, I think that's very poignant, talking about what we see as this clash. And so the other thing, right, is what Nicolas Saldo points out in his Substack, is that there are more or less four competing regimes of hegemony. The two that he talks about the most, and I have them listed out here, or at least, is the masculinist authoritarian China versus the woke Anglosphere. This highly centralized form of government where culture matters, it helps mandate and keeps a healthy masculine population. China looks at the collapse of the Soviet Union, and Xi Jinping especially is something that he's written about, wherein, okay, we have witnessed what happens within Western intervention economically. We can see what happens when a country is liberalized and foreign investment comes in. It leads to collapse of like the state and the civilization. This cannot happen to us. And in doing so, they've been beginning to crack down on Western influence. We've seen this with, video games in regards to what they concern about feminization. They don't want social media time being widely used. They have their own forms of it. They don't want to engage necessarily with outside Western platforms, all of which they want to make sure that men are men and women are women. One of the things you'll talk about is that their absolute hatred for K-pop. This is something that Salado talks about, where they look at South Korea and they don't want any of that within their country at all, and to which I don't blame them. Although the one caveat I would put towards this masculinist authoritarian China, and I kind of want to poke his brain more about this, but that's for a future time, is that how much of this is a reaction to what is already inside of their country. That's the one thing that I'm going to let chat chew on as well, because in my mind, a lot of this is action and reaction. So the United States is out there. The United States is got its influence of what we see. We have TikTok. We have all these things that the United States puts itself out there. All of which, right, is that the Chinese are responding to now a younger generation of people that are raised on this. And this is on top of the fact that, they've got an aging population, about like 165 million people. You've got little to no social safety nets that are equivalent to, say, what the Americans have. And you do have a demographic bubble that both the Chinese and American analysts have definitely been made aware of. So I do think that a lot of this is a reaction, more or less, to what is coming out of what he calls the woke Anglosphere, especially from countries like New Zealand, Australia, the Anglosphere, the Five Eyes, Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. And in doing so, this embrace of liberal, woke, corporatist hegemony is what we see all the time, where how every, June or whatever month now, because I know in Canada has a different month for it, the UK has a different month for it, but every June here in the United States, the gay pride flag goes up on the social media company's profile picture, all of which can be seen all the time. And in doing so, puts everything out there for the rest of the world to see. We used to talk about how it's McWorld, or the McDonaldization of the rest of the world, and this sort of liberal hegemonic push of soft power. We're now sort of seeing the interim, or the inverse of that, where it's not just the yuppie commercialization that we had saw out of the 1980s and 90s. It is now very much a more diverse and inclusive idea somewhere. And just as the sun never sets on the British Empire, the gay pride flag never sets on the American Empire. All of which is now this back and forth between what might happen next. If you've read Unrestricted Warfare, the famous text from two Chinese Air Force colonels in 1999, there are ways to counter this. This is where you'll see propaganda, media, economics, soft power playing a much larger role in a way that, should also be combined with the economy. This, is seen in a way where the United States, in its openness and its tolerance and its engagement, ironically sets itself up as a way to be, taken down from the inside. This is where you get into a position where this woke Anglosphere is woke and inclusive enough, right, to where you will have literally Stanford University, who has had multiple instances within the last 5 years of professors, being charged with spying, or Confucius centers being propped up across the West, all of which benefit the Chinese, not to mention America's most elite institutions make bank off of foreign money, especially with Chinese students coming to places like Harvard and Yale. So there, again, action and reaction. And we're seeing the United States, especially under this administration, continue sort of the economic and militaristic saber rattling, but it isn't necessarily addressing the culture. Did the Senate pass a bill about competing with China in technology and manufacturing? Yes. Is that necessarily going to be doing too much? Not necessarily. Although the one fun thing I did find out of that Innovation and Competition Act was that we all of a sudden just decided to legalize more genetic editing and allowing things for like animal DNA and human DNA to be spliced. So we're kind of competing with the Chinese on our CRISPR level technology. But one fun thing just to keep in mind. And Asuno Hamar's name in chat kind of points out, like, you can't trust that institution, especially if you are someone that wants a more Western-oriented identity. One of the fun things that I always get clashed with all the time on this channel is the desire that I want my country to be something, whereas, it's like, oh, well, you kind of also want the gay to come down. It's like, yes, but the world doesn't pause, and you want someone or something to be there and take over that, because no empire lasts forever. But we are seeing these clashes of civilizations, which, in course, doing so, puts the ideological and epistemological first principles of these countries at gunpoint. We see the Middle Kingdom desire to be seen in the world. We see the wanting to be the center of trade. We want this century of humiliation to be over. And all of which, clashes with this American primacy, democratization, the liberal universalization that has been sort of the foundational block of American empire, I would say, since Teddy Roosevelt. American empire really, the foundation is set forward after the end of the Civil War. Teddy Roosevelt really begins to take advantage of it. And from there, Woodrow Wilson's, we're going to fight to make the world safe for democracy, all of which has been the primary, way in which the U.S. has operated in its foreign policy, at least in its rhetoric, and even more so now in the establishment of governments during the Cold War. But those are the competing clashes that we're seeing, all of which, of course, sets us up for inevitable confrontation, because the American attempt at containment and democratization and liberalization through markets did not have the same effect as it might have had by encouraging glasnost and perestroika inside the Soviet Union under that old Gorby. But of course, that also leads us to the wonderful John J. Mearsheimer approach of the tragedy of great power politics, also known as offensive or structural realism. There was an article that was printed out for the November-December edition of Foreign Affairs magazine. I had just gotten it in my inbox. I read it last night. That's why I put the meme up on Twitter and on YouTube yesterday, because it's great that one of my biggest influences put out this. He described that the ongoing clash over Taiwan and the containment that is coming from the United States is leading towards a clash, what is he fears to be a likelihood of conflict, a kinetic hot war between the two countries. And in this article, Mearsheimer discusses that there are a lot of roads that are not taken. The same way in which the United States responded to the fall of the Soviet Union is the road not taken when it comes to China at the end of the Cold War, and it begins to see itself rising as an economic power. And realists, and he of course would know, I mean, he's been important to the realist study of the world along with Kenneth Waltz for decades, and he's arguing that instead of trying to contain what is most likely going to be your biggest geopolitical concern, although keep in mind that there were some realists that were far more worried about Japan until their economic crash in the mid-90s, was the fear that this greater incorporation into the global economy, the greater economic interdependence, the making the most favored nation status permanent in the early 2000s, all of these were mistakes made by the American government. All of which has ensured that the United States is setting up the greatest rivalry that it has. And echoing that of Posen, he identifies that the People's Republic of China has the capacity to reach economic and military parity, which fundamentally goes against every aspect of American grand strategy that has been discussed. Whether you're a liberal, whether you're a realist, whether you're a constructivist, one of the biggest things that gets discussed about American grand strategy is territorial sovereignty, and then ensuring that there is not a singular state or a coalition of states that can challenge the United States diplomatically, economically, or strategically on the world stage. This is sort of the aspect of, American primacy, or at the very least to maintain its current sector of geopolitical influence in the world. Mearsheimer argues that this, moving away and trying to incorporate them does not work. The argument that you'll see from non-realists, especially from liberals and constructivists, and even rational choice theorists will talk about, that it is more rational to incorporate China than to see them as a rivalry, fails to see how the world as is. And this is where he really references his book here. That if you haven't read Tragedy of Great Power Politics, one, you should, and two, after this is done, you should go back and watch my previous Sunday stream on offensive realism, because that's where it talks about the world is inherently anarchic. The world is chaotic. There is no sovereign globally in the world. There's no global sovereign. And in doing so, what is the natural state of the world? The natural state of the world is to seek power, defend it, and attack when necessary to keep said power. And all that they are doing in this world is trying to make sure that that happens, either through coalition, singular state is a military power, attaining nuclear threshold status, all of which is how the world operates. And bringing China into the fold as some sort of likelihood to liberalize and democratize is not going to happen. Especially when, the last 2.5 decades, my entire lifetime is going to tell you anything that obviously didn't work. And the idea that we're even seeing out of this administration is that, we want to view China as a partner. There have been numerous books written by foreign policy officials. One of the most famous one, I believe, is the When China Rules the World, the conversation of what the Western world should look like. All of which he thinks is all setting up to lead to conflict, just because of the nature of how the world is. Anarchic, chaotic, nations striving to seek and defend power. And to add on top of this analysis, and I'll add a few thoughts of my own here, is that we discussed on this channel the idea of power transition theory, that any time an existing hegemonic state recognizes that there is going to be a rising power, or that it sees itself dropping down in status, that it is more likely to thrash, react, and try to contain that power. And in some instances, in the way that we're seeing the United States and the Western world act now, we are seeing that kind of reaction happen from a transition standpoint. The reason why Mearsheimer calls it a tragedy, and the reason why he has always claimed that it is a tragedy, is that no one wants conflict. No one wants the loss of human life. No one wants that destruction of civilian life and the trade and how that affects people, the flow of medicine, all of which makes it a tragedy, because it is something that we as human beings, at least at this current point in time, are bound to do forever. I don't think that we're going to have a global sovereign anytime soon. And there will be no kingdom on this earth, at least until the second coming. So all of which, it puts us in the state where nation states are going to cling for power. And we are now only beginning to see a reaction from this administration, and really starting with the Trump administration, this more hawkish, more realist perspective that if things are to take place, we're not going to be prepared for it. And hence all this rapid posturing now and putting itself out there. That in which puts the United States in a very awkward position, because it's sort of now in a position where, it's going to look over the cliff like a cartoon character and realize that there's no ground beneath its feet. And I think that's exactly where we're at least here. And when it comes to the nature of Taiwan, if you'll remember, there was a leaked phone call or press statement from Trump's administration about the issue of Taiwan, about how to respond to it. And, Trump was very simple in saying, listen, they're like 5,000 miles away, or we're 5,000 miles away or so. They're literally right next door. What do you think is going to happen? So in doing so, we're seeing this clash where, the desire to be realistic about the situation and what would most likely happen is now clashing between the desire for hegemony and these clashing worldviews between the Western paradigm of politics and the Chinese paradigm of politics, all of which sets things up possibly for conflict. But that becomes the prime question, the real center point for today's lecture, which we'll get to at the end. So again, posturing, politics, and maintaining alliances. This is now what we're kind of seeing, because the United States' position and power in the world has been questioned for some time, especially about midway through the Iraq War, if we want to call it from 2003 to 2011. The idea of American decline has been heavily questioned, especially that in the East, as China grows in its power. Specifically, I remember in Foreign Affairs magazine, roughly around 2011 when I was in high school. Good God, that was like 10 years ago. At the time, there were members of the Liberal Democratic Party lamenting the fact that the United States is not doing enough within the Asiatic region. It's not doing enough to discuss how to keep its allies at ease, South Korea, Australia, India, and Japan, with the rise of China, both as a military, the development of artificial islands, and the construction of the PLA in its Navy, the People's Liberation Army, its naval forces plan. From increasing its position, encroaching on territory, and being more militaristic about claims to various contested islands. The Senkaku Islands come to mind when it comes to China and Japan. So, of course, this has been talked about for quite some time. Now, these containment allies, of course, are putting up that red pressure and rhetoric. There has been increasing conversations, of course, between the United States and Australia and the UK to put more pressure out there, which is sort of a shift in policy, because if you'll recall, not too long ago, the United Kingdom was planning to send some of its navy out to the South China Sea. And in doing so, the United States said, hey, don't come over here. Don't go over here. Let's put our focus more so on Russia. And in doing so, months later, of course, AUKUS comes out. We'll talk more about that in just a second. But it was this interesting posturing that, no, you don't need to come over here. We got this. We'll be fine. And we're going to stand out and do well. And, of course, what inevitably happens after the Afghanistan withdrawal and its pullout is, in an effort to save face, the United States quickly retrenches and tries to posture itself. And all of which the United States is trying to reassure its allies that it is present, you can rely on us, which of course always brings in the question, what is the worth of an American promise? But things have definitely escalated, right, in these maintenance of alliances. The United States has been recently on this sort of goodwill tour last summer with Vice President Kamala Harris going to Vietnam and discussing about increasing relations there. The Philippines, which is infamously under Duterte, has kicked both the United States out, let China in, kicked China out, and has allowed the United States to come back in. sort of recognizing where its goose is cooked. And in all of that, the United States is trying to, retrench itself, reposture itself, and let them know that we're here to stay. This is sort of the hegemony in action that we see from the United States, this American primacy. And of course, we have the AUKUS agreement, the Australians, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And all of that has been questioned. I think it's more of a posturing thing than it actually will be for, significant strategic engagement. While it does snub the French, it also sort of re-emphasizes that this is an Anglospheric worldview of the international affairs, especially within Southeast Asia and that area. The Australians are getting American nuclear-powered technology. They're not getting nuclear weapons. They are simply, getting nuclear-powered submarines, because Australia and New Zealand have incredibly strange nuclear energy policies, to a point where you can have conservative MPs of the Liberal Party in Australia call nuclear power the N-word in the newspaper, which is a fun fact for y'all if you didn't know that. But this agreement has been criticized by others like Edward Luttwak, famous for geoeconomics and the importance of strategy over politics, arguing that this is more posturing and it won't strategically do anything, because by the time that nuclear-powered submarines are enrolled into the Australian Navy, they're probably most likely to be outdated, which was the same argument that was made for AUKUS happening in the first place, which was that we're going to replace these old diesel subs that won't be available until the 2030s, and things have been slow in production and have cost more money, and we aren't expecting them to come out anytime soon. So all of this is more or less a lot of political reposturing, a lot of retrenchment after what can only be described as an international loss of face, which of course, most likely the Chinese will take advantage of. But aside from the military aspect, as we've seen with more recently the G20 meeting and the COP26 climate issue, there has been a push now for liberal climate hegemony, because of course, as the Western world tries to address the issue of climate change from our lovely people in charge, and the idea that this needs to be taken care of, that nations like India and China are not meeting their goals, or that China is cheating on said goals. These are the claims, and they want them to push more and to take lead on it. For people like Barack Obama and Joe Biden, along with mainstream Democratic Party politics, the idea of being the global leader on climate change is going to be the way forward for the United States to lead an international community, as it recognizes what it calls an existential threat to the world and to mankind. Whereas China is trying to not, why would you want to be led or have the carrot in front of you for funding or for investment if you can lead it yourself, or simply just take advantage of the fact that the West is curtailing its energy and manufacturing capabilities and continue to produce more and more and take care of it. All of which, right, is going to be the position that we see here between China and the sort of climate hegemony that comes out of the West. All of which, right, is this issue of posturing, party politics of internal countries, and the maintenance of these long, tenuous alliances, because the AUKUS agreement was recently announced. It wasn't having a lot of consultation. It wouldn't be until the end of that week when AUKUS was announced that, okay, Australia, the United States, South Korea, and India are going to have a conversation, the Quad, about what's going to happen. Which, again, brings us now to the discussion about warfare and either reunification. What is it going to be through politics? Is it going to be through economics? Is it going to be sort of this thing that just we sit and watch by and happen? And that therein brings us to the question of saber rattling and confrontation. So there are many think tanks, both in the United States and in Beijing, that will argue that confrontation for an actual kinetic conflict seems likely. In the same way that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has its clock to midnight, it's 5 minutes to midnight. We are at 100 seconds to midnight, according to the Atomic Bulletin, or the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. But there gone are the days of strategic ambiguity about what the United States would do if there's going to be a push for a mainland invasion or military engagement from the People's Republic of China towards Taiwan. And I have this image to the right here that I want to talk about before I get into what I had in mind. So this is Andrew Mikta. He works for the Marshall Center, and who he's got tagged in there is a gentleman from the Heritage Foundation. And I'm just going to read this to you all because I find this incredibly interesting. I'm increasingly concerned that our projections as to when we might end up in a kinetic conflict with China and Russia are overly optimistic. The timelines are likely to be shorter than assumed, in part because of the constraints Xi and Putin will face going onward. Tagging his friend from the Heritage Foundation, who in his bio, by the way, is trying to prevent World War III, which is with one tweet at a time. And, we've been arguing that our likelihood of engaging in conflict happens more and more and more in the same way that we can claim that, Iran will have a bomb more and more and more soon and soon and soon. But, of course, there is some posturing here that I think is worth discussing. There has been the announcement, yes, that there are American advisors, I believe it's less than 3,000, that are currently on the ground in Taiwan to prepare them for guerrilla conflict, insurgency, all of which has been confirmed by the current Taiwanese president, who has taken a very hard line against reunification and the 1992 consensus, in which previous Taiwanese presidents and the mainland Chinese government operate under, about how, they're distinctly politically separate and being there. Advisors in the same way that we would probably call advisors major troops on the ground engagement in Vietnam. All of which puts the United States in this awkward position because there was a sort of an incident a few months ago, or I want to say a month and a half ago, in regards to a submarine that had to quickly be withdrawn from the Taiwanese Strait, in which they sort of pull out, and in doing so puts them in a very awkward position because China is now aware of where some of America's nuclear armed missiles are. Or at least it's Ohio-class submarines, all of which, makes things awkward. And since this has happened, mind you, and there are a couple of people, such as like Balding's World on Twitter, who is an excellent Chinese analyst and provides excellent commentary. If you're not following him at Balding's World on Twitter, I highly recommend that you do. But he had mentioned that one of the interesting factors since the acknowledgement of troops on the ground and this bumping of a submarine incident happened, there hasn't been as many, if not any, ADIZ, Air Defense Identification Zone violations over Japan or over Taiwan. All of which discusses the fact that Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone does cover a large chunk of mainland China, and they have also been seeing massive preparations for conflict in the area as well. So one thing that we can see most recently from that, is that out of Japan. Of course, the prime minister had recently stepped down, and the new prime minister is the former defense minister of Japan, of the ruling party. And secondly, they have said that they are willing to go all in to defend Taiwan. This was prior to, of course, to the Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing company leaving or planning to announce its move to Japan for its manufacturing and industrial base by 2025. However, they have conducted some of their largest naval and self-defense force drills since, really since ever. This included, civilian operations participating. This included, the Navy, its Marine Force, its military, and communications, of course, with the United States military presence on Okinawa to measure and keep track of how well things could be communicated. All of which, puts things in a very saber-rattling, confrontational attitude between this Western coalition of Australia, tentatively the Philippines, tentatively India, South Korea, Japan, and the Taiwanese military. All of which brings us to the wonderful questions at hand. The two questions that I want to talk about as we hit the final thoughts here, I'm going to try and bring this all together, is the conversation of what makes a state and the probability of war. Of course, if we take a look at the Montevideo Convention back in the 1930s about the Organization of American States, or the Conference of American States, discussing the idea of statehood, which sort of leads to the acceptance of declarative theory of statehood in international relations, which usually comes down to four basic tenets. It has a distinct and stable population. It has a government capable of engaging in international relations, defined borders, and I believe the last one I think is its ability to produce and sustain itself. All four of which can be argued, if you want to be for Taiwanese independence, would argue that this is distinct in its form of government. It does engage in international relations. It does have the ability to stand itself, and it has its own unique population. All of which would fit the means of declarative theory for under international relations and statutes about engaging as a state for independence. All of which, right, of course, comes into clash with the idea of, this is Chinese territory. China has a historical claim to this. What you are seeing is the rightful will to power. Obviously, the communists won the civil conflict. They declared themselves, the state at hand. Obviously, they should be the ones that claim it. And in doing so, right, is the argument towards that Taiwan should be accepted and reunified with mainland China and Beijing. And there are pro-Beijing political parties inside of the Taiwanese political structure and system, mind you, something of which may be the potential avenue for China to engage in reunification efforts. All of which, right, allows us to take a look at the internal factors there. But that's just one analysis here. And Fanami puts out a really good comment for those listening after this live stream, is that Mike's comments uses the similar reasoning of that of Peter Zeihan, that if China and Russia are to make a play by force, they would probably have to do so relatively soon. And while I am inclined to agree with that analysis, if they're going to do anything by force, they would have to do so now, especially while the United States military is not at its strongest or highest level of readiness, if recent information between the US and UK can show us. The concern would be about the production level of the Chinese Navy. They want to have more ships than the American Navy. They're currently trying to produce them. If they're pressured to engage in conflict, you're probably right. That reasoning would make sense, that it has to be now or never. I just do not think that it is now or never, considering you have an energy problem within China with blackouts, coal shortages, the necessary aspects for trade. I think that's why they've recently brought in Russia for joint military exercises with their navies out in this area of the world, to a point where even President Vladimir Putin had said that any sort of agreement or alliances are not off the table. So why not engage and have a potential aspect of Russia and China working together? But of course, the internal factors within Taiwan plays into another role, because there are infiltrators within the Taiwanese government. There are spies that have been announced, and probably dozens more that we don't even know of, because of course, if they're good spies, people like you and I aren't going to know. And there is a reunification sentiment within Taiwan, within their polity. It's not the most popular, or at least in terms of numbers and electoral output, but that doesn't mean that they don't have the ability to have substantial sway when it comes to Taiwan-Chinese policy between their two countries. The other thing that I think is important for us to talk about, of course, is the question of economic interdependence. So we've talked about economic interdependence theory on this channel before. And I think the best way to look at it is sort of the Dale C. Copeland viewpoint of economic interdependence about the theory of trade expectation. So the theory of trade expectation is that nations that are heavily economic interdependent upon each other for trade are most likely not going to engage in any sort of conflict or view each other with any animosity if the expectation of trade in the future is to be expected in a way to be positive. So if things are to maintain the status quo, or if they are to improve, there's no reason to view each other as enemies or to view each other with animosity. However, the corollary to that Copeland accurately points out is if there are changes to that economic relationship, states will pursue whatever means necessary to ensure that they can defend themselves. So this means more domestic manufacturing, more reshoring, and that increases the likelihood of diplomatic and strategic concerns over those resources. And if there's one thing that the Biden administration has continued to use from the previous administration that he had fortified himself into, was the ongoing tariffs that the United States government has on the Chinese and on certain Chinese nationals. All of which, right, puts the economic interdependence point into serious consideration for the likelihood of conflict. What I will say about the possibility of war is that I do not hold a crystal ball. I can give you the analysis and I can tell you what my thoughts are. It doesn't mean I'm going to be right or wrong. I have been wrong on this channel before, and I will admit it happily. And I'll revisit the subject if I get something wrong. But if war happens, the real question that I really want to ask, and this is what I have on there on a bullet point, is the will to fight or the will to power. There has been some recent news articles and some recent polling data about, oh, who's really willing to defend Taiwan, and the most recent one I had saw was that 52% of Americans said that, they'd be willing to have American forces defend Taiwan and its democratic government. One, keep in mind that consent can be easily manufactured. I have a really great video about that you should watch. But secondly, I don't think that America has the willpower to do so. It has just ended a 20-year conflict that has led to thousands dead and hundreds of thousands of more due to suicide. I mean, it's 22 a day here in the United States. It's absolutely depressing. We currently just got our asses handed to us in a military exercise between the United States Marines and the Royal Marines in the UK, and we do not have the capacity to, do the one thing that the Navy is really good at, which is put out fires, where it has to rely on domestic firefighters to do so. I think that if there is going to be a push for Taiwanese reunification to be a part of the People's Republic of China, then it will be political, it will be economic, it will be through soft power, it will be through infiltration and subversion. The United States is going to happily thrash about, while, as Jay points out in the chat very clearly, there's no point for Russia and China to interrupt their enemy while he is making a mistake. And that's more or less what's happening here, is that the United States is not in a position, I think, to engage like it once did. This is not 20 years ago. This is not the same military of 20 years ago. Hell, it's not the same military of even 3 years ago. All of which puts you in a position that it's most likely that conflict won't happen. And if you really wanted to look at it from, say, rational choice theory, then yeah, you're probably not going to put yourself out there in a position that's going to have the cost of war outweigh any potential payoff. And Sunos Hamar just sent in a great super chat for €5. I'm incredibly thankful for it. If you're economically dependent on another nation, you will not be more likely to go to war to end that dependency. One of the things that Copeland points out, Hamar, is that nations do not always have the desired or expressed interest to go to war over that dependency, or especially if things are well. The other corollary he points out is that nations do want to secure their own economic interests. They might view that dependency as a vulnerability, and they'll try their best to reshore regardless of what the expectations are, which is something, ironically, the United States does not do when it comes to things like rare earth minerals or semiconductor production, because we have environmental regulations that prevent that. If you're dependent, you're not likely to go to war with them and into that dependency. That's true. But again, the expectation theory is what I think Copeland is most well known for. But no, I appreciate the super chat. Thank you. But then the last point I think that is worth mentioning, of course, is the worth of an American promise. We have talked about, this phrase gets mentioned a lot. I know George Friedman talks about it in his book Flashpoints, The Emerging Crisis in Europe in 2016. And it is something that is always worth discussing. The American promise post-Cold War is not worth much. And anyone can see that, whether it's from Trump pulling out of agreements towards the fact that the United States promised after German reunification that NATO wouldn't move towards iridescent territorial claims. It clearly did. I feel like the worth of an American promise is not worth anything. The Budapest Memorandum, we skirted around our security agreement with Ukraine after the surrendering of nuclear weapons. George H.W. Bush's logic, of course, was that, well, why bother? Because the United States didn't have it ratified by the Senate, so it's not necessarily going to happen. And the similar argument can be made from other countries as well about ratification. That and the invasion of Georgia in 2008, where George W. Bush didn't do anything despite in support of, sort of a stronger, pro-Georgia position. All of which, from the Afghan pullout to the flip-floppiness of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Paris Climate Accords, to really almost any position now that the United States has, is the argument that, hey, the American promise isn't worth too much, at least within diplomacy. And the Western world is really beginning to promise on that. It's just on things that we don't necessarily, as a country, manage to benefit from. This is where you'll get realist criticisms about American promises where, oh, hey, we talk about trade or security engagement or combat effectiveness, but it's never for others. This is why you'll have people like Barry Posen argue for restraint, because a lot of our so-called allies under this promise is the argument that, oh, well, they're not really, paying their fair share, they're buck riding or buck passing, And so it doesn't really benefit the United States in a way that it should. And as the United States continues to be politicized in its military, as Josiah Lippincott will point out quite clearly all the time, and those of the Claremont Institute will tell you that, yeah, we're moving, towards a position that is not tenable for, ready combat effectiveness or unit cohesion. So all of these things, I think, put us that if there's going to be a kinetic conflict, it is sort of a now or never position, both for the United States, because technically it does have the strategic advantage. But at the same time, I don't think it has the capacity, the will to power, or the unit cohesion or military readiness to do so. What we are viewing now, I think, is that we're looking at it in a position of the best way I think that we could describe it, and I think that Dave Bergeron points out that we do have to think differently, because we don't look at it as, this is economic policy, this is geoeconomics, as Letvak would point out. I've talked about this with Semiagog on his channel, where we talked about Afghanistan, that they wish to view things in geoeconomic terms, when it comes to like the China-Pakistan economic corridor, using Afghanistan to get towards Iran and the Gulf Coast for oil resources, or even to get to Turkey for access to the Mediterranean. They view things in a civilizational state and a geoeconomic state, whereas I think as many on the right will openly declare that sort of the United States has been turned into nothing more than this large economic shopping mall where anyone can come in, this freedom of movement and unfettered immigration, all of which is going to happen in a way that I think is going to show us some real detriment in the future if conflict were to happen. So my final thought would be, I don't know, war is now or never, but I do not find it likely for the reasons discussed. And secondly, I do think that if there's going to be reunification, it will be through infiltration, economic, and political subversion from the People's Republic of China. And if not, then we are going to be looking at ourselves at quite an ugly stalemate for some time to come. And Bolero sends a super chat that is a little spicy. And he says, Purple Hearts for all of our transgendered heroes in the military that go through reassignment surgery win. Well, I'm sure that there will be tactical dilators, as Darren Beatty points out, for all to enjoy. So just you wait. I'm sure it's a matter of time. And alrighty, so I think we all know what time it is now. It'll be time for announcements and everyone's favorite part of the show, which is the Frog of the Week. So some announcements, like I had said, this was before I put a timeout. So tomorrow evening at 8 p.m. Eastern time, I'll be over at Joel Davis's channel talking about John J. Mearsheimer and the tragedy of great power politics. Just take a look at the community tab and you can see the link to it. And I'll be over there tomorrow. It'll be a great conversation. But so what else is going on is that I moved Substack. Instead of it being weekly, it'll be twice a month. I got really inspired yesterday. I had a lovely video call with Conscious Caracol. So if anyone who has seen my face, it would be him. And he can probably tell you at length about how terrible my mustache looks right now. But the one I'm working on is about transhumanism. So we'll be talking a little bit about what I find to be the oncoming transhumanist horrors that lie ahead. After that, I will try and get a video out this week. I'm still away from home. My mother has taken a bit of a dip in her fight against the coof, but I believe tomorrow she's going to get a monoclonal antibody treatment, so hopefully she's doing okay. But today is her birthday, so I will make sure the chat says a happy birthday for my mother and go for that. But I will try and get something out for all of you guys. But yeah, after this, I'm having a lovely call with my mom because it's her birthday. After that, my movie review outline has been put more or less sketched out, so I just got to write the script now and find the clips. I'm going to play a very dangerous game with YouTube's copyright thing, and we'll see how it goes there. But we're going to talk about the movie Her, because I think that is the perfect movie of Bugman dystopia. So that's what's going to happen. I don't know when it'll come out, but it's definitely something in the works. On top of that, where I'm also submitting stuff for Lomez's Passage Prize art contest. That'll be both a submission of some poetry and a short story. As soon as I finish that and I submit it, I will post it on Substack for all of you to read. I really am proud of the short story, so I think you guys will really like that. And then I have about 35 minutes of real talk footage that I need to edit and put together. So we'll get some of those, and as things get colder and colder, I want to space them out sporadically, so you all still have some lovely, cozy fishing content and extemporaneous remarks to listen to. So those are the announcements I have for what's going on. I know things are a little bit slower, But that's what I have for you all, and I appreciate y'all's patience. But again, there's been plenty of stuff for you all to munch on. I was on the cigar stream with Mr. Academic Agent yesterday, as you could tell, with all of our based profile pictures mishmashed together. It was a lot of fun. And then, of course, tomorrow to talk about Mearsheimer with Joel. So a lot of stuff's going on. It'll be a lot of fun. So now that we're at the end of the show, it's time to get to everybody's favorite part, and that is the Frog of the Week. And as always, I'm very thankful to Cyberpunk Internal Affairs for making that lovely theme. I am going to commission him when he's free and available, because I think I want to do something as a stream or video intro in the future, so it'll be a lot of fun. But for today, and given that we addressed the Taiwan question, I thought what more fitting than to have a frog from that island of Taiwan. And so today we're going to be talking about the Taipei tree frog. It is endemic to central and northern Taiwan, known for its tropical setting and its environments and forests and lowlands, all of which its natural habitats being lowland forests and marshes. Sometimes you can see it on plantations, primarily areas with a lot of moisture and swampy environments. And what more fitting than to have a Taiwanese frog on as the amphibian. There we go. It's back. Cool. Lovely. So yeah, like all frog species, they're sexually dimorphic. And do we have audio now? Let me know, because I don't want to have Frog of the Week ruined. Well, it says we're still live, so I'm not going to have any dead air here. Anyways, like all frogs, they're sexually dimorphic. They usually grow to about 2.2 inches for females. Males usually get around to 1.9 to 2 inches even, so roughly 5.5 centimeters in length. They have horizontal pupils, and both the males and females are capable of color changing. So they can usually be green with a bright yellow belly, like we see in the picture here, but they are also known to be very dark green or sometimes a darkish brown color as well, in order to blend with their environment as a defense mechanism. On top of that, during mating season, which is usually sometime in the spring, they will dig a foxhole and then call out for a potential mate. So they will burrow often into the marshy and swampy ground, stay within their foxholes, and call and hope that a woman comes on over for them to spawn their mates. So they are metachromatic, I believe is the term, in order to change colors. So that's what they do for their defense. And that, my friends, ladies and gentlemen, is the Taipei tree frog. What a more fitting frog to talk about as we talk about the Taiwan question. So with all that being said, we can just catch up with you guys and chill out. I would like to thank my top tier patrons: Fearless Leader, Cowering Bugman, Hunger, and Focron. You guys are part of the Rain Frog tier on Subscribestar, link in the description. All of which I'm very thankful for, because you guys provide $20 a month every month to keep not only my medications cheap, but in order to help me buy books and equipment to keep the channel going. You guys are awesome. In doing so, you guys keep it all going. So either by becoming a channel member or by joining and being a patron on Subscribestar, you get access to videos early. I always make sure that you guys get to see them early before they premiere. And on top of that, you will have access to a special Discord for game and movie nights. So I plan on, once I'm back in my normal living space, to have another game night for you guys. We did it last time. I got a lot of fun footage playing a variety of stuff with everyone. So if you're interested in that, the links are in the description down below. And Subscribestar and both channel members have access to the Discord. So there's a lot of fun and a lot of time. On top of that, there is merchandise. As you can see there, there's the Frog of the Week t-shirt. It's also available in a mug. But I would love to thank the lovely artist that has been sharing or been creating these things, because I'm going to share my screen now and share something a little bit different with you all, and show you the latest edition of the merch at Mr. Prude's Wares. Also in the link tree description below. But here it is, every Sunday, Geopod politics and frogs. I thought that it was cute as hell, and it's a little more realistic. I like the more realistic view of them. So yeah, this is what I have, and you can find that at mrprudswears.com, and it's going to be great. But as we get close to the end of today's stream, I do want to remind you all that tomorrow's stream is going to be at 8 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Central, over at Joel Davis's channel. It is also linked in the community tab. We'll be discussing John J. Mearsheimer and the tragedy of great power politics. But I would love to thank all of you who tune in every Sunday. The more you share, the more that you enjoy these views, the more that we can get people to learn things about the world and how it works, whether it's theory or just international affairs as it is. My gut tells me that I'm going to be looking at the issue of Ethiopia and Sudan, as they've both engaged in coups and ethnic civil wars once again. Now, there are a lot of, there's a lot of things in there, but to hang out with you guys for a few minutes, let's see. Iron Dragon says, in my reference to Huntington about tribal politics, yet Algeria's constitution forbids political parties based on race, ethnicity, and religion. While it is the biggest country within Africa and the Arab world and Mediterranean, the one thing that I would keep in, you would keep in mind is that doesn't one country doesn't prove the exception to the rule. So I mean, it just varies, but that was Huntington's take back in like the 90s. Algeria, I think, would be a prime exception to the rule. Yeah, Tom Nguyen, it's not necessarily, they're having a civil war of sorts. And so I think the fun question is going to be is when does the Chinese really start kicking in? I'm sure they'll get involved, but the real question becomes how closely involved are the Tigray rebels with the Egyptian government and intelligence? That'd be the fun thing to explore. Let's see here. Can you put Parmesan cheese on eggs? I don't see why you can't. If that's how you enjoy it, just go for it. Tuesday says, should I donate my kidney and send you thousands and thousands of dollars? You should send me thousands and thousands of dollars, but I already have one. So if you want to hold on to that and wait maybe 10, 20 years when I need another one, then yeah, by all means, just hold on to it and then you can donate. I plan on still giving commentary 20 years from now. So let's go. Hector Newman says civil wars that don't end in balkanization are a tease. They can be if that's the way that you want to look at them. Civil conflict or any sort of war is typically not what we want to see unless it's absolutely necessary, because the loss of human life is always a tragedy, and millions more make it a statistic, as Mr. Stalin would say. But yeah, all is well. I'm still doing okay. Whatever I have has got some sort of congestion and some pressure behind my eyes, but I don't think I've got anything that's going to be an issue. Tuesday asking me, do you think Virginia will find enough votes to change things to McAuliffe? Well, they've already conceded, so it would be very sketchy if they suddenly decided to do that like they did with that truck driver in New Jersey winning his election. So, well, I mean, we'll see. I hope not. But again, I have to play it very carefully here on YouTube. Mycroft asking, should you put Parmesan cheese on eggs? Well, I guess it would depend on how you like your eggs, Mycroft. I've never actually put Parmesan cheese on my eggs, so I couldn't really give you an answer. But you know what? I will make an egg when I'm done here, and I will do that, and I will tell you. John Gordon asks, Prudentialist, predictions for the U.S. midterms. Well, if the latest polling is to indicate anything about the general environment, that it looks to be heavily within the Republicans' favor. But I mean, unless you're going to get actual like this is my issue that came out of Virginia, right? Was that, yay, Youngkin won. It literally took a Carlyle Financial Group holding investor who went to the World Economic Forum and talked about the wonders of Chinese investment into the United States, into the global economy. All he had to do was lean into that one issue that actually mattered to voters to win. And so that's my problem with the midterms, right? Is that unless you really clean out the party, which is of course unlikely because it's not going to happen. I'm not really going to care. I mean, it's going to be like the Charlie Kirk position that we hear about critical race theory. I don't know if he's going to do much. And if you buy into sort of the Yarvin-Rufo differences, that unless the institutions are changed, right, you can make changes to law, but there will always be manipulations of procedural outcomes to get a desired result. And that's my biggest issue. But yeah, that's probably what's going to happen, right? Is that They will lean into the culture war. They will win some elections based on the culture war, and then nothing's going to really change from there. Farbod says, I think you can buy kidneys in Iran. I know that they do. You can actually. It's one of the few states where there's financial incentives for organ donation, which is not necessarily found elsewhere. I do think that the United States should change and just do an opt-in system. However, there is concerns about that because people will look at opt-in systems and then be like, oh, well, this person's got it on their card, so let's just, not. There's a healthy debate over it, but I think providing financial incentive can either exacerbate it or make it better. It just depends, and I don't know enough to really give you an answer or to talk about it in depth. I'd have to really look into it. Let's see here. The more I think about it, the more I feel the whole... Oh, this was from Melphis. I wanted to read that. The more I think about it, the more I feel that the whole people trade equal no war in a very modern liberal way of thinking, considering how the Flemish War invaded a lot, just as an example. I mean, that's the thing, right, is that it is a liberal way of thinking. I think that the best nuanced way to take it, right, is like the trade expectation theory. Because, I mean, trade happens between nation states. Like, we do live in a globalized world. And as we saw from the early modern era, even Europeans engaged in a kind of, trade. However, it was far more mercantilist, which I think is something that should be considered by reactionaries on how we want to look at things economically and how we want to view nation states. But the age of like colonization is different. It still exists, I think, in a cultural fashion, which is something to consider. But no, you do have a very good point of looking at that. Let's see here. Trying to make an Iranian kid. Well, academic agent had made plenty of jokes about mine when all of the stuff had happened with the surgery. So don't worry, AA's got plenty of jokes for you. What would Burke do? Well, it depends, because Burke will say things like, well, without incremental, no civilization can survive change without it being incremental. It's very Whiggish. But at the same time, right, Burke would say something along the lines of like, people have inherited rights, and it's very, very ethnically oriented, or like, a founding stock kind of orientation. So he's kind of all over the place, but he does have some speeches in regards to foreign trade that I think are really worth looking at. And I mean, nations do trade while they're at war. I mean, like, there's still things that go on back and forth. There's just increased strain on supply lines, which, I mean, if war were to break out between the US and China over Taiwan, I would only imagine that the financial sector would take a massive beating. The US would probably hit a recession. Our ongoing supply chain issues would be increased in differences. Those are some things to keep in mind. I'm not sure how it would play out, but I know it would have a significant economic impact here, which, if you're like a rational choice guy, right, that's where the whole cost of war versus potential payoff are things to consider. Iron Dragon asks, is Taiwan the new Ukraine vis-a-vis American geopolitical obligations? No. And the reason why I would say no is because the United States seems far more likely to actually fight over this, or at least posture itself over that, than he would than the United States did with Ukraine. We've clearly put more of an effort than the problems that exist out of Ukraine in the memorandum at Budapest and back in the 90s. A lot different. Would this be the first time that two nuclear powers go to war with each other? No. The Kargil War in 1999 happened between India and Pakistan, and they are nuclear-armed states. In fact, there have been multiple border clashes between India and Pakistan, both two nuclear-armed states, that have fought each other in traditional kinetic means without utilizing nuclear weapons. So no, this wouldn't be the first time. I think it would be the first time since two major powers had directly engaged each other, not through proxy conflict. All of which happens, right? Like that's something to consider. Let's see here. Melphis would not even work without the U.S. being an overlord to your enemies more friends. See Venice, UK, etc. Yeah, and I mean that's the thing, right? Where you'll see the issue of the United States like being viewed as both like the enforcer of global trade, but the enforcer of said rules. So who knows? It all really just depends. All of which there. So all things to consider there. But before my internet gets any worse, I'll just answer a few other questions. There was some Sino-Soviet clashes in the 1970s, Bolero, I believe so. At the same time, China also fought Vietnam in 1979, and that was the last time that China's military had really been battle-tested in a state-to-state conflict, and they did not do so well. And it's been a long time since 1979, but it is things to consider that that's really the last time that there's been major engagements. Do India or Pakistan's nuclear weapons even work? It takes a lot to keep an arsenal functional. I am not too sure, to be honest with you. I could not tell you. In the same way that how do we keep our arsenal functional, right? We talked about this last week on Halloween. That we do testing that is models or electrical functional tests, but we don't actually know whether or not the nukes work. Although we did just recently withdraw from like the intermediate range missile test treaty, so who knows? Maybe we'll start seeing tests happen again. Couldn't tell you. But we are nearing the 1 hour and 30-minute mark. And before my internet gets any worse, because I'm even more in the middle of nowhere before, I'm going to see you all tomorrow evening at Mr. Joel Davis's channel. There's plenty of stuff in the works. There might be a Substack reading this week as well on my channel. Until then, ladies and gentlemen, I will see you all next week. Take care. Enjoy this November and this fall weather, and be prudent, everybody.